Hello, and welcome to Livid Ladies, the podcast.
I'm Julie,
And I'm Jane.
and today we'll be talking about therapy and mental health.
Whoop whoop.
Yeah, big topic for today, and I know it's a topic that we're both pretty passionate about.
Yes, I firmly believe that most people generally could benefit from therapy. Like, literally everyone should go to therapy.
I absolutely agree with you, and I'm obviously biased because I'm working in this field of mental health, but I totally agree. I mean, with a few exceptions, I think most people can benefit from it and can find it helpful if they're willing to engage in it. So I totally agree with you.
Yeah, yeah. So, what was your journey to your degree and your interest in mental health? Have you always been interested in like psychology and stuff, or like how did that start for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my parents were always really interested in psychology. They kind of exposed me to Carl Jung's work when I was really little, to Freud's work. Not so much, they weren't huge fans of Freud, but they were kind of fans of psychoanalysis, in an intellectual sense.
Hmm.
And so sometimes they would talk about it at the dinner table, and I distinctly remember them trying to explain some of Carl Jung's like ideas when I was 5 years old, and I had no idea what they were talking about, but it sounded interesting. So I think that was my first real exposure to psychology. And then when I was in high school, we did a unit in my AP English class on psychoanalysis and literature, and looking at literature and famous pieces, famous authors from a psychoanalytical lens. And I think that's really what first got me started on this journey of just trying to explore psychology more. And when I started college, I decided, I think I might want to major in this. It's really interesting to me. But I'll just start out with Psych 101 and see where it goes. And I completely loved it. Definitely decided to major in that right away. I didn't know what I wanted to do after graduation. I really wasn't completely sold on being a therapist or being a psychologist, or, that wasn't really in my mind. I just kind of went into college thinking this is something I'm interested in. I really like learning about it. So I'm just going to do this and see where it takes me. And then after I graduated college, I taught high school English. I was also an English double major. And that's always been my first love is just language and literature and reading and writing. And so I decided to take a job as a high school English teacher. And after a while, I was like, you know what? I really like, after doing therapy myself, I was like, I really like therapy. Like, I love it. It's so helpful to me. I think it could be helpful to other people. I also saw a lot of mental health issues in the classroom that were not being addressed adequately. And so I decided, what, screw it. Let me go for this. And that's kind of the story, I guess, of how I got into this field.
Yeah, yeah, that's really cool. I find it really interesting too that it was your parents as a 5-year-old that first talked to you about it kind of, which is to me that's crazy.
Yeah.
What was the conversation like about mental health in your family? Like, is it something that was encouraged or that you talked about like on a personal level, or is it kind of this abstract, like academic sort of topic?
Yeah, it's absolutely more abstract. Well, maybe not so much anymore. But when I was 5, it was an abstract intellectual pursuit. It was an academic pursuit. It was something that you discussed, kind of like, highbrow discussions kind of thing. And my parents love talking about things like that in general. They're pretty educated people. So I think it just falls in line with their personalities and what they're interested in. So, yeah, the discussion wasn't so much about mental health, mental illness, psychological well being. It was more so about look at this interesting, topic or idea. And to be quite honest with you, I think they like Carl Jung because he had a religious bent. Like
Oh.
he was kind of a religious person, at least spiritual, and he wrote about some of that stuff. And so I think they gravitated towards him because they were also very religious. But yeah, no, it wasn't. We never really talked about mental health in my family as like something that impacts us personally. So, what about
Huh.
you?
Well, I think my parents definitely had less of an educational worldview, I guess. They definitely looked at things on more of like a just a really spiritual level. Um, and I mean, just no slam on them or anything, but like they just don't have the same level of education that your parents do. But I grew up, I think my dad would talk about psychology or psychiatrists in sort of a negative way,
Mm.
that it was very Freudian. They had a very like sort of, I think, archaic view of what therapy even looked like. I remember one of the first times I talked about actually going to therapy with my mom. She kind of shared with me that she thought it was like you lay down on a couch
Mhm.
and the therapist, like, you know, blames other people. That was another thing that I remember my dad saying, like, "Oh, they just tell you that it's your mom's fault or your boss's fault." And he kind of
Mhm.
presented it to me as like this sort of money-making scheme, like a lawyer or something, where they're just trying to get you to keep coming back or something. It was really strange. Um, but yeah, like a super Freudian, like, you must really just want to have sex with your mother kind of weird sort of. And I'm like, that's not what therapy is.
Yeah.
And I remember having a conversation, I think probably it must be like 6 or 7 years ago now, that I had a conversation with my mom. I remember um kind of trying to set her straight and like be like, that's not how it is anymore.
Yeah. That's so interesting that that was your dad's view. It kind of makes me sad that that's how some people view this profession, because to me, being an insider, I do not see psychologists that way at all. I think most of the time psychologists and therapists go into this profession because they want to help people. They're not really concerned about money making schemes. I mean, I think there's money making schemers out there in every profession, but it's just interesting that that's how your dad presented it to you. And I guess I also wonder if they had any experiences with psychologists or psychiatrists or therapists, and if those what those experiences might have been like, if those colored their view and what they told you.
Yeah, I mean, my parents don't really talk very much about um their childhoods or their life before being very into spirituality
Mhm.
and becoming Orthodox. So it's it would be really interesting for me to know if like any of them ever saw somebody growing up, but I really doubt it. I super
Mm.
doubt it. Um And growing up, it was always this mindset of like, well, your spiritual father should be enough and the church should be enough. And if you have a problem, then you just go to confession or talk to your spiritual father. It's not, you know, the need for professional help,
Mm.
like a quote unquote worldly person or,
Mhm.
oh, shocker, like maybe you need to take medication. Ooh, no, like it was like
Right.
big no no. And they really just uh like were really disapproving of that entire concept my whole childhood. So,
So how did you break away from that? Because you're in therapy now.
yes, yeah, I see a therapist now and I love her and it's super helpful. Um I started cutting when I was in college and so that was when I first um somehow I don't and I honestly don't even really know like how I was able to sort of see that I needed help and actually take the step to go get help. I almost think it was like a rebellious act in a way that I was like, well, I'm going to go see what this is like.
Mm.
So it sort of, on one hand, it felt good because I was like, trying to take care of myself. But on the other hand, I was also curious. Like, I'd always been told this was something you shouldn't do or shouldn't need. And while I also struggled with like feeling ashamed, like I remember like sitting in the waiting room for the first time and like looking around at the other people that were there, um, and being like, oh, I don't know what I would do if I saw somebody here that I knew. Um,
Yeah.
so I definitely felt ashamed, but I was also really curious what it would be like. And I definitely hit like a really low point and kind of a rock bottom for myself as far as the depression and anxiety that I had for a super long time that went undiagnosed and that I didn't deal with my entire
Yeah.
really came to a head my first year of college. So that was when I first started seeing someone. Um, he was not a particularly helpful therapist. I didn't have a very good experience with him. I didn't really respect him. Um, I don't think he was super good at his job. He kind of told me that I should like snap my wrist with a like hairband instead of cutting, and I was like, "You're dumb." Um,
Yeah.
but I definitely hid that from my family. Like I didn't share with them that I was, seeking help. They honestly didn't notice or seem to care that I was struggling at all anyway, which was,
Mm.
you know, also a whole other issue of like I wanted them to notice that something was wrong with me, but then they like weren't. Um,
Yes.
so it wasn't until honestly super recently that I admitted to them that I go to therapy. It's like a
Mm.
really recent thing that I've started saying out loud.
Yeah. I'm curious about what that's been like now that you've revealed that to them. But I also want to point out two things that you said that I think are so interesting and just provide a lot of just are really interesting. You said two things about going to a therapist. So one was it was kind of an act of rebellion. So there's almost this like defiance of like I'm going to break away from what my parents have told me, because I'm assuming at that time you were kind of breaking away from other things that they had told you anyway, and other things that you had learned as a child. So there's that piece, and then you also said that like your parents weren't noticing that you were struggling and they weren't giving you the attention or the validation that you craved. And so I wonder if for you going to therapy was, on the one hand, an act of rebellion and defiance and a way for you to assert your own individuality in the world. And then also, on the other hand, a way to have somebody who's just there for you, to listen to you and to pay attention to you and see you as a person when your parents couldn't do that for you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you're right. I didn't really know what that attention felt like necessarily, and it was something that I was definitely looking for in other aspects of my life. So I would try to get a lot of attention from guys, or I don't know. Yeah, I basically was just constantly trying to get people to pay attention to me, and obviously, I'm sure that super logically happens to people who come from a childhood with neglect. Um,
Yes, absolutely.
yeah, that's
I relate to that a lot. I think I felt the same um, going to therapy for the first time. I also went to therapy in college for the first time, and I think it was very similar reasons. I think for me, I just needed somebody to pay attention to me and listen to me mostly. Um, I wasn't even thinking about what my parents might think about me being in therapy. I wasn't necessarily concerned with that, but I think on some level there was an act of rebellion on my part too, to say like they've always kind of scoffed at this or told me that I should be able to get over my depression on my own. Um, so I'm just going to do this thing. But also, like, somebody is literally sitting there just paying attention to me, no one else. And having grown up in a household full of kids, like, I have lots of younger sisters, nobody, sat and just listened to me and wanted to hear what I had to say. And so that was like a life changing experience for me. Um, and I just hear a lot of attachment trauma playing into why we went to therapy and why that was healing for us. Um,
Yeah, for sure. That was a huge piece of it, I think. Um, it's also fascinating to me too right now. I think my family is going through a big transition. Um, my sister and I are in our 30s, and I think it's also like a stage of life where we're really breaking away from our parents in a different way. My sister just had a baby.
yeah,
So she's got her own little family unit now. Not that it's not a family when you get married, but it changes your whole dynamic in your whole life. Um,
absolutely.
and she has really struggled with some postpartum mental health issues. Um, she has had postpartum psychosis and is now really struggling with postpartum depression. Um, and it was so extreme and so bad. And the symptoms of postpartum psychosis are really shocking to see like in person. And
Hmm.
I wasn't there. I talked to her a lot over the phone, but it was really intense to see somebody that I love and care about so much really be truly delusional and have like true paranoia, like to a level I'd never seen before. Um, and also like looking back, so we had visited her right before the psychosis kind of set in, and she had just had the baby, and we were at her house helping her out and stuff. And looking back, I can see like the signs that it was starting to happen. Like she was very euphoric, and she wasn't sleeping at all. Um, and I thought, oh well, she just had a baby, and she's happy, or oh, of course she's not sleeping. She just had a baby,
Hmm.
it was like that. But she was like, "Look at this beautiful bug on this curtain. Like, look at his lacy wings. Isn't that amazing?" It was like kind of like that. And I was like, "Well,
Hmm.
yeah, no, it's a very pretty, but I just didn't realize it." Um, and so through that whole experience and which is like a whole other, I mean, I could talk for hours about just the story of that
Yeah.
uh those couple of days when it got really bad, but it's, I think, opened a door in my family to having to face
Hmm.
the need for professional mental help and therapy. It it was undeniable, like, and especially coming from, um, you know, my parents' daughter. They were like, "Oh my gosh, we have to look at this. We have to deal with it. We can't just sweep this under the rug. Like,
Yeah.
you have to face it." So this whole situation forced them to look at it, and it was the first time that my mom has admitted that maybe she would benefit from therapy, and that was like
Yeah.
huge for me to hear. I couldn't really believe it. Um,
That's incredible.
yeah. So there's been a bit of a shift because we're going from my parents really being into like homeopathy. We weren't vaccinated growing up. We barely got any like physicals, as
Hmm.
kids. Really irregularly even went to like a dentist. Like it was super spotty. And I mean, part of that was probably because we didn't always have health insurance, but I also think they don't really, have a lot of respect for like science in general. But it seemed like they didn't place a lot of value in like doctors at all, really. Too. So like we were going from like a pretty extreme, like here, this like tincture of herbs will cure you, to
Yeah.
like, oh no, yes, you know, she really needed psychological help, and that was really good. And I think I actually could benefit from therapy too. I mean, I was like blown away.
That's pretty incredible. And it's hopeful. Like it makes me feel hopeful for your family. Like it's awful that you all went through this experience. I mean, I know we've talked about it and you've expressed just how traumatic that was for all of you and difficult and challenging and having to watch, like you said, someone you love struggle with intense paranoia and delusions. Like that's terrifying. But I also hear some hopeful pieces to that, in that your family is a little more open to mental health services. I mean, your sister had to go to the hospital, right? She had to be hospitalized. So it's kind of like when that happens, there's no denying that there's a mental health concern that needs to be addressed.
Right, right. Yeah,
So
and
is
they
this when you shared with them that you're in therapy yourself?
I didn't, I don't think immediately that weekend. I mean, I honestly kind of blacked out a lot. It was super intense and scary, and my sister was calling me in the middle of a panic attack, and she was also saying some really scary things about, hurting herself and all that. Um,
Mhm.
and I honestly, I can't really remember like the specifics a lot. And it kind of hurts my brain even now just to like think about it. It was pretty recent and really traumatizing.
Yeah.
Um, I do remember like in the past couple of weeks since then, and sort of processing all of it with my therapist and then processing it with my parents, I've really been trying to normalize it for them. So I've somehow been able to stop feeling ashamed and I don't care about what they think about me necessarily anymore, at least not about that. And so I've been trying to normalize it. And I was like, I go to therapy. I think it's really helpful. I think everyone could benefit from therapy. I'm just trying to, destigmatize it and normalize it for them just by telling them that I do it and lots of people do it and it's super helpful. So,
That's amazing. And it probably takes some bravery on your part too. Like, I know I can also relate to wanting to be accepted by my parents and being worried about what they think about me, because we differ on a lot of beliefs and worldviews, and I'm not very forthcoming with them about that stuff. But it sounds like you've been able to be a little more open and honest about who you are and what you do. And I wonder what their reactions were like to hearing you say that you're in therapy.
yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about this too that like um the first reaction is usually very quiet or like nothing. Um and it usually isn't until later when they say something that you realize they heard you even.
Yes.
So like I know you described something that happened with your mom. I don't know if you want to talk about that story.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I shared with my mom that I'm in therapy. I think this happened maybe 2 years ago. So I've been in therapy for about 3 years, 3.5 years. And so 2 years ago, I mentioned to her in passing that I'm in therapy. I think she had asked me if I could drop her off somewhere. And I told her, like, yeah, I can. I just have therapy at, you know, 1 p.m. or whatever. And her reaction was kind of dismissive. I mean, I think she was shocked because we don't talk about therapy or being in therapy in my family at all. Therapy is for other people. Therapy is for people who struggle with really intense, serious mental illness. Not for someone like myself who struggles with depression and anxiety. Even though that can also be challenging in its own way. It's obviously very valid, and everybody who struggles with depression, anxiety, they could also benefit from therapy. We know that. You and I know that. It's just that I think my mom was shocked. Like, well, you don't have schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or, anything like that. Why would you possibly be in therapy? And she didn't say that to me, but I could almost see those thoughts running through her mind. So her reaction was just to kind of look away from me. She kind of gave me a weird look at first, and then she looked away from me and didn't really say anything. Um, and then later on, when I was dropping her off wherever she needed to go, she was in my car, I was driving, and that's when she brought it back up again. So exactly what you're describing, where it's like, oh, so you did hear me, right? That's when I noticed, like, okay, you did hear me, you just didn't want to say anything about it then. And her initial reaction when we started actually talking about me being in therapy was, what could I have possibly done to you to make you be in therapy now, to traumatize you so bad that now you're in therapy? And she wanted to know, like, do you go into therapy and just talk to your therapist about me and your dad and what we've done? And so she seemed to take it pretty personally. um, and I basically said, no, like, I don't really go into therapy and like have a bitch fest about you and dad. I mean, obviously she knows and I know and that obviously our childhoods and our families of origin impact us, and they have a huge part to play in our mental health and well-being. So obviously I talked to my therapist about what I've been through with them, but I think she almost thought it was just like me going in and spending all of my time talking about how angry I am with them, or how much they messed me up. Um, so her reaction wasn't very positive, um, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think that that was a really similar reaction for my mom when I was talking about it with her. I think that she definitely had that same sort of train of thought, like, oh, what? I must have been a horrible mother.
Yeah.
Like, you must just be talking about me. And I wonder, I have like no validation for this at all. Like, my conversations with my mom are not like like super deep usually.
Yeah.
But I wonder if, because now my sister has had this very intense and very obvious mental health issue, that now she's like, "Oh, it's okay. We can all look at it. We know it was bad. It's a thing you can point at and say, look at this. This was traumatic. We can all see it." And it
Hmm.
like gives her permission to say, okay, well, maybe therapy is a good thing, or like I can understand why you go to therapy. Um, because she doesn't have to think it's about her anymore, or something like that. I wonder.
That's so interesting. I think you probably are onto something, but it's also interesting to me because even if you do have, a genetic component to your mental illness, which I mean, pretty much everything has a genetic component to it. Um, there are still environmental factors that impact the way that shows up for us. So like whether you're not like I think your sister was diagnosed with bipolar, right? Bipolar disorder.
I'm not sure if that's official yet, because
Okay.
I think they typically want to sort of work with you, or observe you for like 6 months in order to make that
Yeah.
official diagnosis. I think because of the like ebb and flow, the like waxing and waning
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Um, but it is true that um, many people who suffer from postpartum psychosis do have an underlying bipolar disorder. And
Mhm.
I, looking back now on like our childhood and knowing my sister,
Yeah.
I could see it.
Yeah.
Not like in an extreme form, but I could see earmarks of that. So
Yeah.
we'll see what happens with it. I'm curious to see what her final sort of diagnosis is, or how it plays out.
Hmm.
But yeah, there's that genetic component there.
Right. Like there's a genetic component and like it sounds like your mom is kind of holding on to that and giving herself permission to seek out help because of the genetic component, but like there's also an environmental component that does impact the way that shows up. Um like um there are certain genes that are turned on by certain stressors in our life or by certain resources in our life, or they're turned off by certain. So it's not like it doesn't occur in a vacuum, I guess. So while I'm glad that your mom is able to give herself and her family permission to admit to mental health concerns and to admit that they need help, I also wonder if there's a part of her that's just maybe not ready to admit that there were things that were traumatizing that potentially could have caused this thing to reveal itself now.
Oh, that's definitely true. And I mean, right after this big incident happened, it was over a weekend. And once my sister started to stabilize a bit, my mom and I had a lot of sort of processing type conversations, which I honestly resented, because I had
Mm.
also been through it, and kind of resented that she was leaning on me in that way.
Yeah.
Um, because she just wanted me to like listen to her process, and I was kind of like, fuck you, like I'm also dealing with this, also I'm your daughter, also this doesn't feel like a parent child relationship, like
Yeah.
so it pissed me off in a lot of ways. But the fact remains, she needed to process, and I get that. I don't think she really has anyone else to process with.
Yeah.
But yeah, it brought up a lot of things. I think my sister was looking back on her childhood through a different lens, that maybe she had this disorder her whole, for a significant part of her childhood. And it just put everything in a different light. And a lot of things were coming up. She was reminiscing, she was remembering things she hadn't remembered or thought of in a really long time. And she was very angry with my parents. I don't know how she's feeling now, but right away, she was super angry with them for how they had handled things, and also was blaming them for not um, getting her help when she was a child.
Mm.
Because, it could have affected her life now. Like maybe she wouldn't have had to have gone through this insane trauma, in the same way, if she'd been set up better. And I don't, so I don't blame her. Um,
Absolutely.
for kind of holding that resentment. But, then my mom was, talking to me about it, like, and she basically just wanted me to tell her she was okay. Like, oh,
Hmm.
you're fine. You're not a bad mom. And I was like, I'm not going to do
Hmm.
that anymore. I
Hmm.
have done that for her in the past, and I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah. Does that feel does that just feel like it's not genuine for you to do that?
It's more like it's come to a head where we now have to look at it. I think
Mm-hmm.
that before this big event that affected our whole family, I kind of was like, you know what, fine, the past is in the past. Um, I guess I didn't mind sweeping it under the rug because, like, I'm fine. Like, I'm an adult. I don't live near them anymore. I can disagree with them. I'm strong enough now to like have my own opinions and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So like I I guess I was just kind of like, well, I think it would do more damage than good. Like I thought it would just really hurt her feelings and like what good is going to come from that? From me being like, yeah, actually I'm really mad at you and like, there were a lot of traumatic things in my childhood and like this thing that you did could be considered abuse and blah 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 and like what so I was like what good would come from that? Like I would just be like kind of I don't know, stabbing her and twisting the knife kind of, like what's the point of that? So I kind of was just like, oh, it is what it is. Like I wouldn't be the person I am today if it weren't for, all these things that had happened. And I just kind of changed the subject or like turned it into a way, because she's actually asked me, she'll like get into these kind of moods. I think she has depression and anxiety and maybe some other stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
um she'll get in these kind of a dark place and she'll call me and be like, "Was I a bad mom?" It's never like, "I'm sorry. I
Mm-hmm.
was thinking about it and you know, I did these things and I know I'm sorry, like looking back, I wish I could have done things differently." Like it's never like a constructive thing. She's always asking me to just validate that she's okay. So she's always
Yeah.
like, "Was I a bad mom?" Like, you know, um I don't know. She'll just say these things that put me in a position of having to be like, no, no, you're fine.
Yeah.
Um, and I have done that basically in the past. And yeah, now I think that we have to face it. Something has to change. Like this cannot continue in this way. It's not good for anyone. And especially now, my sister really, really needs support.
Yeah.
Needs her family. And I'm not here for some kind of like shitty like no you're fine nothing's wrong with sweep everything under the rug and just pretend like everything's okay, let's just move on. My mom has also been trying to do this thing, or she was when she was trying to process, where she was like, can't we just remember the good things? Can't we
Mm-hmm.
just focus on the positives? And I'm like, no, it's not to say that there weren't positive things that happened, because there were. you
Yeah.
know it's not that I don't have any happy memories. It's that right now we have to look at this painful, traumatic thing and deal with it. And
Yes.
she, like, can't
Yeah.
want to.
Right. She can't, she doesn't want to, or it's just too painful. Um, and yeah, it's so interesting. You said something about like in the past, you would kind of be like, you know what happened was in the past, we can't do anything to change it. All we can do is keep moving forward, like that kind of mindset. It's so interesting because my husband, Ed, brought that up last night. And he's
Ooh,
gone through his own trauma and, he's had some horrible things happen to him. But he's very much the kind of person who he doesn't deny what happened. He just doesn't talk about it. He doesn't think about it. He doesn't give it the time of day. He's very focused on the future. And he said that last night. And I was just thinking like, yes, you're right. Like it did happen in the past and there's nothing you can do to change it, but it impacts our future. It
right.
impacts what we can do. It impacts our present. It impacts the way we relate to other people. And I think you're so right, Jane. Like there's a certain point in our lives when we have to just confront all these things and lay it all out and talk it out, because if you don't and you keep living your life in denial or you keep avoiding your past, it's going to catch up with you eventually, right? And my therapist said this one thing, which I found so, so helpful. There was one really difficult conversation that my parents and I had about some of the issues we had when I was a child. I have a lot of attachment trauma because my parents, kind of, they just didn't have the money to raise me at the time when they had me, and so they had my dad's mom take care of me and raise me for the first 5 years of my life. And while that was wonderful, and I absolutely loved my grandmother, and she was an incredible, secure attachment base for me, my parents weren't there. And I think I've always kind of felt rejected by that. And like there's something wrong with me because my parents weren't there for me. And intellectually, I understand that's not, that's not a thing. But we were having a conversation about that, my parents and I was trying to explain to them how painful that was and how traumatizing. Eventually, what happened is that my parents basically, my dad got a job which would allow him to take care of myself and my two other sisters at the time. And so he basically removed us from my grandparents and moved us into a completely different country. And that was probably the worst part of what I went through as a kid, was being pretty much snatched away from my attachment figure, which was my grandmother, and being taken to a whole new environment with people who I saw as strangers. And so we were talking about that. And like, my dad was kind of defensive when we first started talking about it. And then he eventually just started tearing up. And seeing him tear up like that, I felt horrible. I was like, why am I talking about this? Why am I dredging this up? Why am I trying to rehash this? Like, this seems so awful and counterproductive, and now I'm just causing him pain. And I brought that to my therapist's attention, because I also attend therapy and I love it, and I love my therapist. And she was basically like, you know what? There comes a point sometimes where maybe like your dad needed to be confronted with that, and he needed to understand what that was like for you, and that's when you can start healing together. And I think that's what I'm hearing you say, is that like if you and your family just keep avoiding things, shoving them under the rug, and pretending like everything's fine, there isn't going to be any healing at all. And so what needs to happen is you all need to have a conversation about this and be honest with each other, instead of pretending like everything was dandy.
Yeah, yeah. That's really well said. That's so true. And I think that's just kind of one of those like life principles that it kind of sucks, but it's just so true that like you can't just avoid talking about something painful. It won't go away until
No.
you face it. And like honestly, I think it gets worse and worse the longer you wait. Um, and it's something that I've really struggled with kind of my whole life because I do tend to avoid things and I do it automatically in my brain because I don't want to feel that emotional pain. I hate that feeling. I'll do almost anything to avoid it. Um, and I think that's, kind of how my parents are too. I mean, I think it's a human thing, right, too.
Yeah.
It's just this you don't want to feel pain. So you do anything to avoid that. Um, but you're right. It's like unless you can talk about it, and it has to be like a two-way conversation. This is another thing. My parents and I got in a huge fight the last time I went to visit them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I ended up leaving and staying somewhere else one night because I was not getting anything to work with in return.
Yeah.
Like, couldn't agree on anything. I kept trying to explain how they were hurting my feelings and how they were deflecting and blaming and gaslighting me. And they would refuse to take responsibility for
Yeah.
any of their actions or words. And it was coming from such a delusional place. Like whatever we initially started fighting about,
Mm-hmm.
they couldn't even agree on like the story of what happened. Like
Mm-hmm.
they were telling it back to me like here are the events of the day and I was like hang on, that's a lie. Like you're not telling it right. Like
Mm-hmm.
I was there and that's not what happened. This isn't how it happened. And if we couldn't even agree on like what happened that led up to this big fight, I was
Yeah.
like, we can't even like I just don't have anything else to say.
Right.
Because at a certain point you can give and give and give and try and try and try on your end. But if they aren't receptive to it and they don't want to have a constructive conversation, there is nothing you can do. And honestly, that's probably worse. That is like more emotional pain than facing the pain of the trauma itself.
That is such a good point. Yeah, I think sometimes by trying to avoid pain, we cause more pain in the process. And that is such a good point. Um, yeah, that's so interesting. I'm wondering how, therapy has helped you deal with some of that stuff. I know there's a lot of relational conflicts that come up with you and your family, and I wonder if therapy has been helpful or how it's been helpful for you.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely just like I can't even explain how helpful it is. Like I don't think I would be doing this podcast right now if it weren't for therapy. I don't think I would be like moving forward with my life in the same way. I mean, I get pretty extreme depression and like I don't want to get out of bed in the morning kind of thing and
Yeah.
like um and I am not medicated for it and I think that the reason why I'm able to function and can like work through it is because of therapy. And I would rather not be on medication just as like a personal choice. Like, and I wanted to try therapy and do
Hmm.
that kind of mental work before I um, tried the option of medication. But I mean, what you just described, like working on the relationship with my parents, um, figuring out that whole family dynamic stuff is the work right now. Like that's
Yeah.
honestly what we talk about every session right now. It's been pretty all consuming. It's been my entire summer. Um and of course it's none of us expected my sister to have postpartum psychosis or postpartum depression. And that has really, of course, brought a lot more attention to it, and I think has
Yeah.
escalated the situation a lot and made us all look at it. But I think one of the biggest things that I'm working on right now is self-validation, like how to be okay on my own and know that I'm secure in who I am. I know what I believe. And I don't need validation from my parents or anyone else to be okay because I really do right now still like require a lot of validation just to sort of function. Like I don't really feel like I have my own even like I have my own thoughts, but then I'm like, is that okay? Like I
Hmm.
don't know. It's like I don't know how I'm doing unless someone else tells me that I'm doing okay. So I lean on my husband a lot right now to be like, um, hey, is this text that I wrote okay? Like, how did I sound on the phone with my mom? Or like, it's kind of extreme. And when I think about it, I'm like, that's so embarrassing.
Mm.
Like, I I'm an adult woman who should be able to have the confidence in myself to be able to like have a text conversation on my own, you know.
Yeah.
Um so like I'm working on that because you can't control other people. You can't control other people's responses to you. I can't make my parents have a constructive conversation with me. I need
Right.
to let go of this idea that if I can just find like the right way to
Hmm.
explain something to them, that they will somehow just magically see my perspective and agree with me. Um,
Yeah.
that's
So it
just never
sounds
going to
like,
happen.
yeah, and it sounds like you're learning how to accept things on your end too. Like you're just accepting that unfortunately things are this way right now with your parents. And you're learning how to be okay with that while also learning how to validate yourself. And I totally relate to the validation piece. And I don't think it's embarrassing at all. I totally get where it comes from. I think neither one of us were very validated by the people in our lives growing up. And so that's why we kind of seek it out from external sources. Um, and to a certain extent, I think that's okay. I think that's actually healthy to like run things by other people, like for example, your husband, because we don't want to be in a total, narcissistic mindset where we're like, well, everything I do is fine, right? But I think what I'm hearing you say is that like there needs to be a balance because right now it's kind of out of control for you where you're constantly seeking validation and questioning yourself. And so, how do you learn how to use a little bit of that to a healthy extent, but also like be okay with who you are and what you're doing?
Yeah, right. I mean, of course, everything in balance. I mean, I couldn't agree more. You're right. It's one extreme is what I'm doing, the other extreme is being super narcissistic. Of
Yeah.
course, we want to hit the balance in the middle. Um, it's what I don't have an answer for and what I'm still working on is how to be okay when my parent And I think it's different when it's a parent and then like a friend,
Yeah.
um, or someone else, a different kind of relationship. Um, when my parent is not giving me anything to work with, refusing to understand my perspective, um,
Yeah.
even just my mom the other day in a conversation we were having, um, she she opened the door to like asking me what my opinion was. Um, she asked me if something she had done um towards my sister was controlling or not. So she
Mm.
asked my opinion. Um, and I was like, wow, yeah, here I'm just gonna tell her what I think. And I was like, yeah, I do think that was controlling. And she was like, no, no, I was drawing boundaries for myself.
Mm.
And it's infuriating to me when people use that kind of language in the wrong way. It's like you have this idea of drawing boundaries for yourself, which is a good thing. It's a really good thing to know what your boundaries are and
Yeah.
to draw them with people, because otherwise you overextend yourself. You can't function if you're constantly just like, giving, 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 or saying yes to everything. Like that's obviously a problem. So
Right.
like my brain immediately goes, "Oh, good, you're drawing boundaries for yourself." But then she's defending this action
Mm-hmm.
that was not helpful for my sister and was controlling. It was like,
Yeah.
I will only babysit if you aren't hanging out with these specific people.
Mm.
So like that's like a conditional, like my action is based on your action. That's not
Yeah.
okay.
No, that's not the same thing as drawing boundaries.
Right. So that was like it makes me so angry to hear somebody use that kind of language in that way. Like
Yeah.
she twisted it to fit her agenda and to defend her actions. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, "No, you can't fucking do that." And she asked for my opinion. So she opened the door. I told her, and then she was like, "No, here's what I'm doing though." And I was like, "No, that's wrong." And
Right.
then where do you go? Like that kind of thing, that situation drives me bonkers, and I honestly don't know how to
Yeah.
deal with that, because that just happened like 2 days ago and I'm still clearly like really angry about it.
I'm
I
so
honestly
sorry.
I have no answers for how to deal with something like that, except that you have to know that you're right and you're okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not. Like it still bothers me.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, first of all, I'm really sorry that that happened. I know this is like a pattern, and I know you've shared other things that have happened like that. And it's so invalidating and infuriating and painful to have to go through that over and over and over again. Um, but I think also what I'm hearing you say is that, like, well, I just wonder if not only do you have to be okay, but you also have to be okay with not being okay, if that makes
Mm,
any sense. Like the fact that you're still bothered by this 2 days later means something, and I think that's okay that that's your experience.
yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. And I think so. I've been doing a lot of mindfulness. My therapist gave me some homework, which I love. She's super like practical about it.
Hmm.
Like, and I appreciate that. I need a lot of direction. So she gave me this little homework assignment. I'm supposed to do mindfulness every day and then like write down a few bullet points of like, you know, to be like a curious observer of your thoughts and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, and it's been really like I hate sitting down and doing it, but then once I do it, I feel better, and I'm like grumpy, like, oh, of course, this is like a good thing that I should
Yeah.
be. um, but I think that's kind of the work too of like in doing mindfulness, I'm supposed to like observe and think about why I'm feeling a certain way and be curious about it instead of just living in that angry space or that irritated space. I should think about why and be
Yeah.
able to name those emotions and then process them, and then they dissolve,
Hmm.
instead of, because I tend to just kind of live in that like, and another thing, and I'm super
Same.
mad and like blah, like,
Same. I get so stuck in my emotions. That's something I'm working on too. Um, I'm wondering if there are any challenges that you've encountered in therapy, I know you've been through a few different therapists before getting to your current one, and I'm wondering if there are any challenges or any obstacles that you came across on your therapy journey, or if there are any downsides to therapy for you.
That's a really good question. So I think I've had five, I'm on my fifth therapist. Um, and I've probably been going to therapy off and on over the span of like maybe 8 or 9 years now. Um, the downside is building the relationship. It's hard to work on something because you have to have a relationship with your therapist. You have to trust them, you have to respect them. Um,
Yeah,
and I think it needs to be mutual too. Like, you need to feel that from them that they respect you too.
absolutely.
And I've definitely had therapists where it wasn't a good fit. I didn't really respect them. I didn't really trust them. And I mean, I tend to be a pretty open person. Like, I'm not super like hard, it's not super hard for me to just like dive right into like story time about this thing that happened or whatever.
Mhm.
But I do find it more difficult to get to like the root of like why, or like to talk about myself. I kind of deflect and like tell all of these stories about all these other people's problems and like things that they said that were ridiculous or whatever that
Yeah,
bothered. But at the root of it, I think that's when it's hard to really talk about. But when you build that kind of relationship and then you realize it's not working out, it
mhm.
feels like such a waste of time. And then you have to like sort of break up with them and then you have to start over. And that's the part that's really, really, really hard, but it's super important. Like, if it isn't working out, then it's not working out and you need to get out of that situation. And I just have ghosted people, and honestly, like, I'm not even going to say that's a bad thing. Like, if that's what you need to do to like get out of the situation and not have like a crazy anxiety episode, whatever, panic attack about it, like, then do it, you
Yeah,
know? Um
absolutely.
but that's probably the hardest thing. Um, but it's so worth it. It really is. I mean, gosh, I've learned so much, and it's kind of the thing where like when you're in it, you can't see what the progress you're making at all.
Right.
You can't see it while you're in it. You can only look back on it and then you realize where you are now is different and better than
Yes.
where you were.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. The one thing that my therapist does really well, I've been with her for 3 years, and she's my fourth therapist that I've been through. And I completely agree with everything you said. Like, you need to have a therapist that you feel safe, comfortable, supported by. And sometimes it takes a few therapists to get there. But one thing my therapist says that's like super helpful is occasionally she'll remind me, like, do you think you would have said this statement, 3 years ago? Or how do you think you would have handled this last year if this problem came up? And she's constantly pushing me to reflect on my progress. And I think if she didn't do that, it would be very hard for me to pick up on my own progress and to recognize, like, yeah, you know what? I'm starting to handle my anger a little bit better. Like, anger is something I really, really, really struggle with. Um, and I just don't, when it comes out of me, it comes out, and I don't know how to express it in a healthy way. Um, and I'm, now thinking about where I started 3 years ago and where I am now with my anger. I mean, it's leaps and bounds above what I thought I would be capable of. But you're so right. Like, you don't always see that progress. And I think for me, that's what's hardest about therapy, is that it's a long process and it's a difficult one. Like, it's a lot of work. It's really challenging. You have to be honest with yourself and with your therapist, and you have to be willing to engage in the work. And sometimes it takes years. And I think that's the hardest part. It's like, when I first started therapy, I think I thought, I'll do a couple sessions and I'll be fine and I won't need therapy again. Like, I'll figure this out quickly, and then I'll have a few things I can use to, like, but when you think about it, that's not realistic at all, because you've spent your whole life learning one way of living and one way of relating, one way of expressing emotion, and you have to unlearn all of that. So why would it only take 10 sessions to unlearn all of that and learn a new way existing in the world. Um, so you made some really good points.
Right. No, that's super well said though too. So Julie, you are nearly a therapist, full-blown therapist yourself. You're working on your PhD, finishing up your PhD. Um, so as somebody who has been in therapy for a while and is also almost a therapist yourself, um, what is something that you would say to people out there who are struggling with the idea of going to therapy for the first time or um, I don't know, what do you think is like the biggest sort of misconception?
Hmm. Oh gosh, that is such a good question. I feel like there's so many misconceptions about therapists, especially in the media. There's a lot of like TV shows and movies and stuff that portray, especially psychologists and psychiatrists, in a very negative light. And it kind of bothers me. It drives me insane when I see, for example, in The Sopranos, Dr. Melfi doing or saying things that I'm like, that's so unethical. That is so not helpful, you know? And I think, unfortunately, what happens is people assume that therapists are just kind of like gross like that, you know, like there's something gross about them, something a little off about them. um oh gosh, I don't even know where to start with that. I just think, knowing myself and knowing other people in the field, I want to say like 95% of people who go into this profession truly, genuinely care about human beings. They're passionate about the work they do. They want to help other people. They're good at what they do. They constantly push themselves to learn. You know, there's maybe like 1 to 5% of people who go into it for the wrong reasons, whether that's for power or for prestige or whatever. But I think for the most part, most individuals who go into this field are just genuine people who want to help. Um, and I think what I would say to somebody who's considering starting therapy is to take the risk. Um, you know, maybe make a leap of faith a little bit. And I would echo what you said too. Like if it's not working out, you know, if the relationship isn't good or you don't click with your therapist, get out of there. It's fine. You know what the good thing about therapy is? You're not stuck with that person if you don't want to be, you know? I mean, maybe in some cases if you have like court ordered therapy, but I'm just saying like in a voluntary relationship, where you're choosing to go to therapy and start therapy, you don't have to stay with somebody who doesn't mesh well with you. Um, and so, as hard as it is to switch from one therapist to another and to find a good fit, like it's okay to switch around. It's okay to find somebody that you actually feel good about. And I would also say, like, stick with it for a while. You know, give yourself at least, I always tell people when they come in to see me, so I'm getting practicum hours, like clinical hours for my
Yeah.
degree. And so I am, you know, seeing clients and patients and all that. And what I tell everybody who comes in to see me is just stick with it for 6 months. And if at the end of the 6 months we reevaluate and this is completely not for you, it's not helpful, whatever, like I will understand. You at least gave it a shot, right? So I guess my advice would be like, give it a shot, give it 6 months, see how it goes. Um, and you might find that it's, you know, it's something that you never imagined it could be.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Good stuff.
Yes. Do you have
So,
any advice for people having been in therapy yourself?
um, yeah, I think, just building on what you said, don't put a time limit on yourself, right? Um, don't put that pressure on yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think you've said to me before in our conversations, the goal, of course, is to be able to function and be a happy person, all in your own power,
Yeah.
obviously. That's the goal. But even if you're in therapy for years, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's no shame in that. It takes a lot of time, and I also think if, some people have been in therapy for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they, I think, sometimes continue to go out of like the comfort of having that person who is objective and listens to them and pays attention to them. That's a super valuable thing to have
Yes.
in your life. Um, and I don't know that everyone is always, blessed with that type of friend or someone in their life who can fill that role necessarily. Um,
Absolutely.
and maybe that's something that, hopefully will happen for that person eventually. But in the meantime, I don't think there's anything wrong with a therapist filling that role. I think it's healthy.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. And I like what you said about the time limit piece. Like I struggle a lot, and I've shared this with you, Jane, that like I sometimes feel like I should be okay by now. Like I should be fine now. I've been in therapy on and off since 2010, you know. So it feels like, well, I should be, I'm doing better, so I should be okay. Maybe I should, wind down with therapy. But you're so right. There is no deadline. There is no time limit to it. I think it's something that you can kind of discuss with your therapist and figure out, um, how therapy is going for you and how much more you need or all that.
Yeah, and that brings up another thing too is like it's okay to have these kinds of conversations with your therapist.
Yes.
Like, how long do you think I need to do this? Like, I feel like I should be better by now. Um, you know, all of that. And then there's also, if you were like, I always feel like you were talking about the media earlier and how therapists are portrayed in the media. I feel like there's a very weird, like, therapists are sexy thing.
Yes. Why is that?
I don't know. Maybe it's because intimacy is sexy and you're like
Mhm.
sharing these deep, dark secrets about yourself with someone else. And so I don't know, like is it like being vulnerable is sexy?
That is so interesting.
Or is it sort of Freudian? Like clearly you want to have sex with your
You
mom or
know,
the person who's filling this role for you? I don't know.
I feel like, to be quite honest, you're giving TV shows too much credit.
They didn't think about it that hard.
Yeah, I think they probably, honestly, for TV shows, I think they probably just do it for like shock value and, like plot twists and all that shit. But I do know what you mean though. There is, even from my own experience, there is a certain amount of, like, I think as a society, we're uncomfortable with intimacy. And if things get intimate, oh, it must be sexual, you know?
Uh-huh.
You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying? Like, especially I noticed working with male clients, it's like they have such a hard time opening up and like crying in front of me or sharing something that was traumatic. It kind of even makes me think of my husband. Like, he keeps all that in. And it's like when that comes out, like, it's only acceptable. Like, intimacy is almost only acceptable if it's sexual, you
That
know?
is, I think, a really good insight. Yeah. Yeah. Like, I don't actually, if you think about how relationships are portrayed in media as well, I
Yeah.
feel like it's sort of rare to see like a healthy friendship that doesn't turn sexual at some point in the plot line,
Yes. Yes.
generally,
Especially, yeah,
between
especially.
opposite
Right.
sex.
Right. Right. Like if you're looking at a heteronormative like show, it's like if a girl and a guy are friends, you're always questioning in the back of your mind, like, oh, I wonder when they're gonna hook up, you know? Like I
I
wonder
think
what episode.
that's super unhealthy for us
It's
as
so unhealthy.
yeah, as like consumers. I think that's not a great mindset to have.
Absolutely not. Like it's okay to be intimate with somebody on a platonic level, but like be have real true intimacy with someone. Like it's okay to be vulnerable and to be known by someone else and not have it have to become anything more than that.
Right.
I don't know. That could be
Yeah,
a
but
whole nother. I feel like that's such an interesting point that you brought up. Like you started this conversation, we could like turn it into a whole episode.
yeah, yeah. But what I was gonna say to tie it in earlier was that if if you have like sort of sexual feelings towards your therapist, that's also something you should bring up. Like
Yes.
you can speak to, like you are trained to do that. Like
Yep.
that's not a surprising thing
No.
that happens sometimes.
No, this
Because
guy actually brought that up to me. One of my clients, a male, told me like he thought I was really pretty, or he basically said in so many words like I'm attracted to you. And we were able to actually have a conversation about that. And our therapeutic relationship continued. Nothing happened. There were no boundaries broken, like there was no sexual anything at all, and he was honest with me about it. And I feel like that was such a weight lifted off my shoulders, because I was noticing it, and I was like, oh god, like I was kind of dreading it a little bit. And the fact that he just brought it up, I was like, that is so cool of you, dude. Like, thank you for bringing that up, and like now we can clear the air and keep moving forward with our therapeutic relationship.
yeah, yeah. And kudos, because that's brave. And it's like when we do yoga and they're like, thank yourself for taking this time for your
Yes,
body and your mind. I mean, that's really like if you are somebody who's in therapy right now, like just take a second to thank yourself for doing that service for your
that is
body and mind.
such a good point. I love that.
Well, there was that moment, so I hope you did that. I think maybe it's time to wrap this one up in a bow. What do you think?
I absolutely agree, Jane. Thank you for keeping us on track with this. Yeah, we're past the hour. So, yeah, do we want to talk about what made us, should we start with what made us livid this week, and then we can talk about what we're living for?
Yes, that's a great idea. So I am livid about the situation in Kenosha, Wisconsin. For those of you who haven't been following the news, um, there is a black man. His name is Jacob Blake, who was shot 7 times in the back by the police in front of his children. My understanding right now is that he's paralyzed and recovering in the hospital.
Yeah.
Um, I just like again, yeah, we keep saying this about a lot of things, but like we could do a whole episode on this, and I certainly don't mean in any way to like mention this at the end of an episode and do it any disservice by simplifying it, but I can't believe that this is I honestly they just kind of can't believe this is happening. Like
Yeah.
um and it kind of makes me want to cry. It makes me want to vomit. Like and I know I'm a white person that um, I don't see things that are happening in my neighborhood. I don't see what a lot of people in our communities are experiencing. Um, but this is like a super real issue that's happening right now.
Yeah.
And I just kind of can't believe that people are still getting shot. People of color are just getting killed on the streets, and there have been protests. And like, I mean, seriously, like, kudos to the people who continue to protest and carry the torch and be passionate about it for such a long time.
Oh my God.
But I start getting a little depressed. Like, I feel like what could I really do besides march along or show my support like in my daily life, but it's a pandemic
Yeah.
also, so um like what can I do? And start feeling kind of helpless. um
Yeah.
like what is any change really gonna come from this?
Yeah.
I hope so. I
I
don't know.
really hope so too. Jane, I'm glad you brought that up. It's been heavy on my mind as well. Um, And I think I agree with you. It is definitely something I think we've already kind of talked about, possibly doing an episode on maybe racial injustice, or the killings of um, Black and brown people by police officers. So I'm really glad you bring it up. Yeah, it makes me feel completely helpless, to be honest. Like, I just feel so helpless. Sometimes I feel hopeless too. Like, is there hope for this? And I mean, George Floyd just happened. Like, literally,
Right.
George Floyd was just murdered, and now we're hearing about somebody else. And like, I I agree with you. I'm just like, maybe this is my whiteness too. Like, I'm also a white person, and like, maybe this is just my white ignorance, where I don't see this stuff on a daily basis. I don't think about constantly how Black and brown people are experiencing their lives, because I have the privilege of not thinking about it. And it's just like, to me, it's shocking that like it's happening again. And you know what? Ugh. Okay, I don't want to cut you off, but like what I'm livid about too is like related to this. I also don't understand why people are coming up with excuses at all. Like, at all about this. Like, why are people being gunned down in the streets, especially by the people who are supposed to be protecting our society? That in and of itself should infuriate you, and you should not be defending that. Like, there might be explanations for why that's happening, but there is no excuse. And like, I don't understand why this is a political issue. Like, I literally have never understood why people dying and being shot and killed is a political issue, like especially when it comes from Christians, people who say that they're Christian and they support, you know, police. I mean, they don't support police brutality, but they're okay with police brutality. Like, they
But law and
excuse it,
order is just another, like saying law and order is just another way of basically saying you support police brutality. I mean, that's like what you're saying.
basically.
Like, am I wrong?
No, you're right. You're right. I just don't understand, honestly. Like, Jane, I don't understand like why this is a political issue and why we're
I
not
hear you.
all enraged that like people are dying. Like, this is not okay.
I hate that so much. I hate that it's a political issue. I truly, I'm speechless. Like, I can't even understand. The way people speak about it is mind blowing.
Yeah,
I'm honestly speechless. I
speechless.
got nothing.
I mean, I think we definitely should do a future episode on this. I feel like there's just so much to say. I don't like, to be completely honest with you, I don't even know if I can get through an episode talking about this because I just get so upset. And yeah, maybe we can also maybe we can include some resources in the show notes as well. Um and the
Yes,
races.
you can donate, you can educate yourself. There are so many wonderful books out there if you are a white person who needs a little educating about what it means to have white privilege. So
Which
we can
I do.
definitely, yeah,
I
I
need
can
that.
too. We all need to work on it.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll throw those up for you guys, resources.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think we should put some resources for postpartum psychosis and maybe postpartum depression as well, because that was also brought up. And I want people to, if anyone is listening, like, I want people to have something to go to, so we're not leaving them on like a really depressing note.
That's a really good call for sure, and I'm sure I'll talk about it more in future episodes. But it is there's just no education around it. I didn't know about it until it happened to someone in my family, and I think that's
Yep.
how it is for a lot of people. So
Yep.
um, so with that, what are you living for, Julie?
Yeah, let's switch gears. um what am I living for? Gosh. Well, I feel like what I'm living for right now just seems kind of like mundane and unimportant.
No.
That's a really, I just ruined that whole segment. It's supposed to be an uplifting, it's supposed to be an uplifting segment of our episode. No, I think honestly, I'm just living for everything that I'm grateful for right now. Like, I think one way to honor individuals who are suffering right now and individuals who have been killed at the hands of police officers is by being grateful for what I have and using that gratitude to put good out into the world. And I'm just grateful for so many things. I'm grateful that I don't have COVID right now. I'm grateful that my family's healthy. I'm grateful that I have a house and a bed I can sleep in, that I have a loving husband and a loving puppy, and that I get to spend time with them. And I think I'm living for my gratitude practice right now.
Hey, that's important. Good for
Yeah.
you. Yeah. Yeah. So I am living for the fact that the Bucks, the Milwaukee Bucks, the basketball team, decided to sit out their game in protest with everything that's going on. I think it's really admirable,
Yeah.
um, that they're able to do that, and they set the tone. They started that trend so that other teams followed their example, and I
Yeah.
think that's really cool. And so, this is just one more example of how wonderful humans can be and
Yeah.
supporting each other and standing up for one another. So I just really hope that we see more of that and that real change comes from this. So I feel hopeful about that.
I
and
totally agree. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think this is how I like to see celebrities and public figures using their platforms. Like, this is incredible.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
It's good to see. So,
definitely.
well, with that, I think we're gonna sign off, but
Yes.
stay healthy and safe out there, everybody.
Yes. And we will be back with more episodes very soon.